We're recording. Good morning. Today is Tuesday, July 12th, 2022. This is a public deliberation of the Baltimore County Board of Appeals in the matter of Raymond and Sandra Frank, the legal owners of Inverness Brewing, LLC, respondents, in case number 19541 SPH, a petition for special hearing filed by Samuel and Michaeline Yaffe and the Sparks Glencoe Community Council. The special hearing asked that was to determine if the Class 8 farm brewery, known as Inverness Brewing, approved as a special exception in 2017, has exceeded the bounds of what was authorized in that order and what is permitted under state and county law. This matter came before the ALJ, who issued an opinion and order January 21st, 2021, and then on a motion for reconsideration, issued an order on February 16th, 2021. We heard it de novo. The petition, which was filed by Mr. McCann, raised 10 specific issues, of which I think after 5 days of hearings, we can sort of winnow down to a few that have to be addressed. All council filed memoranda, each as requested, giving us what they thought we should do. And everybody had a little different take, but again, the issues were fairly straightforward as I see it. The first was whether the use complies with the special exception is granted. The second, again, as I see it, was the issue of both the number and the areas for parking. The major issue had to do with promotional events, which have not been defined, though council were good enough to give us some suggestions. And in my mind, there is also an issue on how to enforce whatever conclusions we come to. You'll bear with me. The 2017 order included conditions that you may want to look at if you haven't. But with that, there they are. Those conditions, to the extent the original conditions were 7. The first was that the petitioners apply for permits and licenses, which they did and were granted, that they comply with the zoning advisory committee comments from the environmental people, which they apparently also did. and that they get approval from the Department of Planning for a dumpster. The fourth condition was limiting the number of barrels of what they produce to 5,000 a year. The fifth condition was limiting the hours of operation to Thursday to Sunday from noon to 8, with certain allowance to go till 10 p.m. for special events. I limited the number of special events to 8 a year. And then there was a provision to review these conditions after the brewery had been operating for a year. Those were the original conditions. So I'm going to give you my quick take on what I think are the easy answers, and then we can tackle the rest. I think the parking issue is a little bit of a spurious issue as to the limitation of 35 spaces, because the zoning regulations and in 409.6, you'll see zoning concerns itself with the minimum number of parking spaces, not the maximum. So to the extent that there's an argument that the brewery should be limited to 35 spaces, I think that's, with me, that had no traction whatsoever. As to the areas in which the parking can be conducted, in my mind, that is something that we have to address. The bigger issues are defining promotional events, because to the extent that there are events with live music, advertising, either a cover charge or a ticketed event, I don't think there's any distinction between promotional events and special events and normal weekend operations at the brewery. And to the extent that that is occurring, I believe they've exceeded what was granted in the special exception, and we need to focus on that and limit that. One of the other things I think we can dispense with, Mr. Mudd proposed certain amendments to the original order, including limiting production to 2,500, did he say gallons or barrels? But reducing what was in the original order by half. And to me, that's sort of a no-brainer. Having said that, the other item that seemed to be not disputed that Mr. DeShiel Owens raised was the use of J.M. Pierce Road, and the petitioners at the hearing, and to some extent in their Mr. Mudd's proposal, agreed to limiting the use of J.M. Pierce Road and adding a gate. So the road would only be used for farm equipment and not at all for access to the brewery or brewery events. And there was also specific stipulation raised by Mr. Mudd in response to Mr. DeShiel that a cleared fill area that had been leveled was only to be used for the construction of a pole barn and not at any time to be used for the brewery or brewery parking. I also note, because I thought it was eminently reasonable, that most of Mr. McCann's suggestions as the attorney for the original petitioners did not seek to cripple the brewery's operation, but did try to limit it in certain ways as to music, parking, structures, sales, and defining events. So having said all that, Mr. Lauer, you have any specific thoughts? Let's go issue by issue, if you don't mind, starting with whether you think the brewery complies with the 2017 order.
Yes, Madam Chair. I think in looking at the conditions particularly that the ALJ imposed in 2017, I don't see any violation of those conditions. And I think that's important, as you said, for us to focus on. There was no evidence of more than 5,000 barrels. There was no evidence of given to us of being open after 8 or being open for special events after 10. There was no evidence that the promotional events were more than 8 a year. That's just an overview of that part of it. I do think that in terms of the other couple issues, if I might address those right now, the parking spaces, I think that was a minimum 35. I think there was credible evidence at our hearings that the 4 paddocks were pointed out in the hearing of 2017 as other areas where there were parking. I believe the Franks and their evidence related to that. I find that the promotional events part of this, a little bit, like how do we figure that out? I think state law now makes no distinction between promotional events and other events. I think we had evidence of that at our hearing. And to me, that's significant. I think had that been in place in 2017, it might have changed this whole perspective on that.
But what about needing a permit from the state for special events?
Yes, I think they still need those from what I understand, from my review of everything. And I don't think they've exceeded those 8 per year. There wasn't any evidence of that. So to me, that's an important distinction because I think what we're really talking about now is being open between till 8 o'clock or 10 o'clock. I mean, that's what it feels like to me, 8 o'clock or 10 o'clock. I mean, since the state isn't making that distinction any longer, I think it's important for us to also pay attention to that amendment that was, we had testimony on. I do think that the conditions imposed by Mr. Mudd related to the various fencing and sound and et cetera, voluntarily, limiting certain things. I think those made a lot of sense to me. What else can I say? I didn't hear evidence. They talked about way back when in 2017 about odor, and I didn't hear anything on that. I also find it that if the ALJ, which we're to look at that decision, the 2017, wanted to limit parking, he could have. If the ALJ wanted to limit music to a certain period of time, he could have. And those were two things that were, came up during our hearing. So I find in general, in my review of all the documents and everything, that they have complied with the conditions, and I don't see any need to modify, which is the number 7, I believe, after 1 year, any of the restrictions. So that's kind of where I am, and subject to more input and more thought from you all. That's kind of where I am, Madam Chair.
Well, I know one of Mr. Mudd's suggestions had to do with monitoring noise based on decibels in the
Yes,
state and Comar. And I tend to think the Comar regulations for now allowable noise levels are generous. I've been in situations where people have, particularly at night when noise travels more, complied with those regulations, but the noise levels, especially from amplified music, are very intrusive. Plus, noise travels. It's a funny thing. It travels differently with wind, with weather conditions, with buildings, with tree,
yes.
There's no way to control where it goes.
And I think one of the things inherent with the decision to grant the special exception was the fact that there would be noise. And
There's no question that it's inherently part of the use, as is traffic going to be, but I don't think the ALJ anticipated how popular and what a refuge it would become with the advent of COVID, where people sought outdoor venues just out of not being able to do anything else. Having said that, I think once it's been established, it's not going away. I do think they've exceeded 8 events because the neighbors can't distinguish what's an event and what's not. I happen to think one of the issues is that has been raised in some of the memos is new releases. I don't think introducing a new beer should be by itself a special event. I think that's the business a brewery is in. And while I'm on the subject, people think, and I've seen it again and again in Baltimore County, people think farms they move, they build a house near a farm because the farm gives them a bucolic vista and it's this pretty rural scene. Farm's a business. Our zoning regulations recognize that this is commercial agriculture. And it's a difficult business. It's a noisy, often smelly business. People are notified that under our county code when they buy a property. because there has traditionally been a conflict between residences that move to rural areas and ongoing farm operations. And I think the idyllic vision of people who live in the country is a little unrealistic. Farms are businesses, they have big equipment, they have noisy machinery, they have smelly animals. So if you want to preserve farm uses, you're going to preserve all those things that come with them as matter of right, plus what comes with them as in the special exception use. But I do think we have to address promotional events and the noise issues in particular. I also think we should address changes to the site plan. Everybody seems to have concerns that should be addressed by amending the site plan. Ordinarily, a petitioner would do that through a special hearing. Inverness has not done that, but to add a structure, to designate additional parking areas, to define additional landscaping. Traditionally, these are items that amend a site plan. And I think we have to require an amended site plan to address what's there now if we're going to legitimize what's there now or designate parking. And in my mind, once we agree on a site plan, and Mr. Mudd has given us something to work with in that regard, any change to that site plan or whatever use we approve needs to be by special hearing or deemed in violation. So those are my general thoughts, and I don't know if Mr. Sampson is ready to add his thoughts or wants me to continue with Mr. Lauer to go through my last issue was how to enforce any of this.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I don't know what impact it has, but the promotional events issue, I don't know how to resolve it. I don't know if what's been said so far between you and Mr. Lauer is consistent or where it gets us. I think I heard Mr. Lauer say he does not believe there has been, he thinks there's been compliance with regard to promotional events. And you have said there's not, but one of the reasons that you gave, I think, for saying it's not is that it's unclear to the community what it means. And I would say if that's the case, then it's also unclear to the owner what it means. If it's unclear, it's unclear. And for me, that weighs against finding a violation. I think it's unfair to hold the owner accountable to a term that, if we believe is unclear for the community, would also likely be unclear to them. And if what we're doing here is determining whether the owner has complied with the 2017 order, I think there's been at least substantial compliance. The question that I wrestle with, though, is what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to be weighing in what it means going forward. And if that's the case, then I think we do have to wrestle with putting some definition into this term, but I'm uncomfortable doing that. I don't know what promotional use necessarily means. Does it mean how you market something? You promote it by advertising? Or can it mean you have a new beer and you simply have it on site and you are therefore promoting it? It can be as confusing as how you advertise it versus simply how you what so-called event or use you have on site. So I'm not sure what to do with that. And I think you mentioned that we have to wrestle with parking area and what that means, and again, whether we're imposing something moving forward. Your explanation of the need for an amended site plan, which would in turn require a special hearing, I'd be more interested to understand. I think this is where you're going to go next. How we do that, what that means for us today.
What was approved in 2017? You know, anytime you file a zoning petition, you file a petition and a site plan. When it relates to a particular property, there was a site plan submitted with the petition in 2017. It showed certain areas for certain uses. That's definitely changed. And to the extent it has changed in a fairly substantial way, the plan that was filed in 2017 needs to change to embrace those changes, or those changes have to be reversed because they were not part of the approved plan. You cannot separate the plan from the written order. Does that help?
Yeah, but so what does that mean for us? Mr. Mudd has suggested, proposed conditions, which I think unless I'm conflating two different issues, which I hear you to be saying, well, that's all well and good, but we really can't just, if we're inclined to agree with those conditions, we can't simply impose them or agree with them and add them because they require an amended site plan, which we don't have the authority to do.
We do.
But we do.
We can modify or amend.
Well, but not the,
And
we can modify or amend the site plan?
Part of the package, I believe we can.
But I
If
thought
we
I heard
can't,
you say
somebody's
that
gonna be happy to tell us we can't.
well,
But yes, I believe we can amend a plan that is part of the special exception approval.
so when you were saying that an amended site plan would require a special hearing, you are not saying a future special hearing, you are saying in the context of this proceeding?
No, I am saying in the context of this proceeding, if we agree that what the Franks are currently doing or any of the exhibits that Mr. Mudd submitted suggesting restrictions or improvements, we can adopt them and incorporate them in whatever we decide. What I'm saying going forward is after we decide or whatever we decide becomes final, any future changes would have to be made by the submission of an amended site plan.
Okay, future changes
Frankly, as
beyond.
Mr. McCann, I believe, argued, the Franks should have filed for a special hearing themselves to amend the site plan to the extent they added structures, roads, or parking that was different than what they got approved in 2017. They didn't. They did as part of Mr. Mudd's closing memoranda for the first time. We can either accept that and incorporate it in what we do or reject it.
Okay, so when you refer to a future special hearing requirement, you mean for any changes that will happen in the future beyond whatever happens today or when this decision is issued?
Correct.
I see. All right, I misunderstood. I apologize. Thank you. So the interesting thing there with the conditions is accepting what Mr. McCann points out that may have then benefited the owner, but not the community. The conditions that Mr. Mudd is now offering to, or the owners are offering to sort of impose, do I think inure to the benefit of the community. So if we were to reject them, and whether we go through them one by one, or assume we're just talking about them globally, I think these are to benefit the community. Certainly, some of them directly address Mr. DeShiel's client's concern with J.M. Pierce Road. You've mentioned that. Others involve the music, which we haven't really talked about, but that was concern of, you talked about noise, but music in particular with this not amplification issue. So I find it all interesting, but where it shakes out for me is I think we should be, however we word it, those conditions seem to benefit the community, and I think are reasonable to include.
Whose conditions, Mr. McCann's or Mr. Mudd's? Because they're
Sorry,
very different.
I apologize. Sticking only with Mr. Mudd's because they've come up a number of times, and on this issue of what he should or shouldn't, or what's been referred to as what the owner should or shouldn't have done with regard to an amended site plan. I think the conditions that Mr. Mudd is proposing are beneficial to the community and reasonable, and I would be inclined to include them in our order that we issue.
I agree, if I might, Madam Chair. It also includes tree buffer signage, additional screening in areas. There was a number of things, but it also limits the parking to the 4 paddocks and the 35 spaces, I believe. The sound meter and reduction in barrels per year. I mean, all those seem to benefit and address, as Mr. Sampson said, the community and some of the concerns that have been raised about noise, etc. So I would agree with you that imposing these conditions, and I guess we would require that they submit a site plan, or a site plan be accompanied with this as part of our order.
Well, we could certainly attach the plans that Mr. Mudd submitted and require that they, within a certain period of time, submit a site plan prepared by an engineer or landscape architect consistent with the requirements of the zoning office, so that it's enforceable in the future. Mr. Mudd does not address special events at all, other than by talking about a sound meter. And I happen to think that amplified music has no business in an RC2 zone. And I know they should be able to have music. They could even have recorded music. If they're going to have live music, amplifying it, in my mind, is a bad thing to do. Measuring at the property line on a 92-acre farm means it can be very loud. I have a problem with that. The other thing I think, and if you look at the 502.1 criteria, the special exception criteria, I don't know, we're talking about health, safety, and general welfare, congestion in the roads. I don't see overcrowding of land. That really has to do with permitted densities. Doesn't affect public facilities, adequate light and air, not so much. I think traffic congestion has been raised as an issue, but it seems to be a very sporadic issue. And I think limiting the parking areas to the paddocks as proposed would have some limit. My big problem with all of this is enforcing it. It's one of the reasons having an engineered site plan is going to give us some better means of enforcing what we determine. But from what I'm hearing from you is that you do not believe there has been a violation of the original special exception use. That because of the lack of clarity regarding what a promotional event is, you feel there's been substantial compliance, though maybe going forward we should be able to at least articulate some criteria that makes a distinction between day-to-day operations and promotional events. And that we should adopt the proposals in the exhibits that Mr. Mudd submitted as amendments to the site plan. Also, the limitations on J.M. Pierce Road, though they appear in the site plan, they are not in Mr. Mudd's list of conditions. How if at all, do you think we can distinguish promotional events from non-promotional events, these special events?
Before
Well,
before we get there, I'm sorry, Mr. Lauer, let me just add one thing that was important. You are correct, and I may have conflated testimony from the owner with Mr. Mudd's conditions. So I just want to clarify before we move to promotional events. I agree that I stand by it. I don't think there's a violation, but in terms of this concept of music amplification or not, the owner had testified that I thought that they were not using amplification any longer. And I do think if we're imposing conditions, and what you're stating explicitly or implicitly, Chair Dockin, is that there should be no amplified music, whether it's a promotional event or a daily operation. I agree with that. I thought that was in the condition. So that's something that I wanted to clarify before we moved into the promotional events. I'm struggling with, because I'm somewhat obtuse. I say this every deliberation and hearing. I'm struggling with the difference between whether there's a violation of the prior order up to the time we're making our decision versus giving some kind of decision about what's going to happen moving forward. And so I don't have any problem finding there's not been a violation for the reasons discussed. In terms of imposing conditions moving forward and how that's enforced, I'm not resolved on that. I think that the conditions Mr. Mudd has proposed are all good ones. I would add to it, despite his protestation, maybe to the contrary, that there should not be amplified music. So that's a segue for me into the promotional event. And Mr. Lauer touched on this, and I just want some clarity before we go more fully into the discussion. What distinction, what are the consequences of the distinction? One is open for promotional events till 10 rather than closing at 8 for the 4-day operations, 4-day daily operations. I think one of them would have been or was amplified music, but I'm not sure on that. So what would be, why else is it going to matter? And then maybe getting a permit. But in terms of the neighborhood, it extends 2 hours on 8 nights a week. I'm sorry, 8 times a year. What else are the consequences?
Well, I think it is a matter of degree, because the more you promote an event on social media and local papers, whatever kind of media, the bigger attendance you're going to have. If you have, a Christmas event, and as they seem to have local vendors, the vendors are going to encourage people to come. Mr. McCann also wanted to limit retail sales to accessory, which is what they should be anyway, but it affects attendance. And it is only when the attendance gets out of hand that problems seem to arise. And the reality is, we can't control people who want to come to the site. To the extent that the brewery is encouraging people to attend for whatever the particular promotional event is, more people show up. And we could go to great lengths to require parking attendants and all kinds of stuff that they seem to be doing now at some point anyway. But promotional events create bigger crowds.
But arguably, so does promotion without an event. You can the other 3, however many days a year they're open, since it's only open 4 days a week, minus 8 so-called promotional events. Am I correct? There's no restriction on promoting the brewery operation. They can advertise that they're a brewery, correct?
Yes, and they can advertise. In my mind, they should be able to advertise whatever beers, ales, whatever beverages they are brewing on site, because that's what a brewery does. I think that in and of itself, a new release is not an event.
Madam Chair, if I might, based on the testimony, I think that they could have a regular event on a good weekend and have more people than they have on a promotional event weekend, if we can make that distinction. I think that's entirely possible based on the evidence of weather being such a big factor here. My thought is that in the ALJ order of 2017, the only real distinction, other than calling them promotional events, which no longer is in the state law, is the 2 hours difference between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock. And I would feel that, you know, in our review of that ALJ order, if you take out the promotional events, you say 8 times a year, if you take that term out completely. Because I don't think we can limit the advertising in any way, as you suggested, Madam Chair. I mean, I don't think we can say, oh, you can only advertise certain things, certain times, whatever. But the promotional events, the distinction that was made in the ALJ order was the difference between closing at 8 o'clock and closing at 10 o'clock. And in my opinion, I don't think that they've exceeded that. There haven't been any evidence presented that they were open beyond 8, beyond 10 o'clock in the evening. There was no evidence that I saw in my review of the testimony.
If I can add to that, we haven't specifically mentioned it, but you know, another hangup for me is this is not an appeal that happened, you know, in response to the 2017 order. That they're now attempting to find violations and then impose conditions that are different moving forward. We're not, and I don't think anyone's attempting to do this, but just for clarity, we're not to substitute, you know, ourselves in the position of the ALJ and rehear the original case. That's past. We're not making these decisions for the first time. They've been made and they're binding. There might be a disagreement over how to interpret and with particular terms. So as it relates to this promotional events, Mr. Lauer makes, in my view, very strong points, and it's part of what I was wrestling with is whatever promotional means, trying to understand in practice how it affects things. It's more what an event is than a promotion, because they can advertise and so-called promote their business. We've already talked about that. Mr. Lauer has mentioned twice now that the law has changed, and in his view that the only distinction then is the 2 hours, and whether or not more people come or they don't. I don't think that this order that we're dealing with, I don't think it's for us to be determining how many people come or don't. I just don't think that's before us. But I might be missing it. I'm sympathetic to the rural landscape and to the neighbors that complain, but I don't know that that's not what's before us either.
And I might add, neither is the ag easement, which keeps trying to be raised. That is not before us.
Right. So it's
I agree.
not like we're sitting here and we're supposed to be saying, well, did the ALJ get it right or wrong? And should we be deciding whether he got it right or wrong? We're deciding whether the folks, the owners, have complied with what he said. We've discussed most of that. And then it sounds like where we are landing right now is just, are we supposed to be putting something in our order that has a legal effect on how that modifies the ALJ's 2017 order and imposes rights and obligations on these folks moving forward? Is that correct?
I think that is correct, that we are limited in our review, though we could modify the original order. But I go back to saying changes to the site plan that have not been approved violate the original order to the extent that they change the site plan. And to the extent that we believe that what is there should be allowed, we have to modify the original approval as to the plan at the very least, in my
Okay,
opinion.
yeah, so, I mean, so I'm over here and I'm looking at music and I'm looking at parking and I'm looking at promotional events and the other road, J.M. Pierce Road. And as categories of whether specifically those things were violated in actions or inactions. You're saying, but don't forget, there's another piece of this. It's the actual plan itself. And I had not addressed that. And you've now delicately reminded me that that's part of this. And so what you're also saying, just let's say hypothetically, even if we find, as I've urged, that there's no violation of those specific categories when you break them out, you are saying, but you can't get around, not me, but just we can't get around, or the owner can't get around the fact that the site plan doesn't conform to the order.
I agree. And I think to the extent there was basically a stipulation among the lawyers, we can also incorporate the limitation on J.M. Pierce Road. It's shown on one of the exhibits Mr. Mudd introduced, but we should also add language to that effect. One of the other issues that was raised had to do with weddings and private parties. These are not permitted on farms under our zoning regulations. They do occur, but there is no express language in the RC2 regulations, whether for a Class 8 brewery or any other kind of brewery, that would permit what is essentially a catering hall, where you have a wedding, a private party. This has come up repeatedly over the years. I've seen it from both sides. I don't want to open that door. I would say if the Franks want to rent their property for a wedding, it should absolutely be considered one of the promotional events. A wedding otherwise could not occur. It just isn't permitted. Weddings and private parties, unless the Franks are entertaining personal guests. And it affects so many properties. It's, we don't have to address it. It came up. I mention it because I don't think they can push the limits on a brewery to include that.
You've mentioned enforcement multiple times, so I don't want to, we're running out of time here. I don't know if we're required to have a continued deliberation or how this works, but
No, we'll finish our deliberation before we start the next hearing.
okay. So could you expand? So actually, let me rehash where I think we are right now. If I understand what you're trying to piece it together, this isn't what you said, but what I'm trying to pull together is we would find a violation of the 2017 order based on the site plan's non-conformity, but we still could choose to then find that there's not violations on the specific categories, however that shakes out, and then still choose to impose one or more conditions that have been offered by one or more of the parties.
Correct. We do have the right to impose conditions.
Okay, and if we're being consistent, we haven't voted, so I'm not sure where we all are. I'm just trying to get my arms around it. If at least two of us are in agreement that there is a violation based on the site plan, but not a violation, let's just for the sake of argument, find on those specific categories of noise, traffic, parking, J.M. Pierce Road, however they all fit together. And then we get to, we're going to impose some or all conditions that are consistent with each other. What's the enforcement issue that you've raised?
At the point that it depends on the conditions, obviously. If one of them is no amplified music, which seems not to be an argument based on the testimony, we could add that. It's fairly easy to identify, and if there's a violation, the Department of Permits, Approvals, and Inspections would be charged with enforcing it, and the code does provide for fines and the like. On the parking, a little harder to enforce. In reality.
Okay, but I didn't mean to make you like struggle with that, like just to satisfy me. I didn't know if what you were suggesting was where it seems to be perhaps not enforceable or it's questionably enforceable. Do we even go through this exercise of imposing conditions? That doesn't seem to be what you're saying. We'll just consider the conditions on their merit and benefit, I suppose, and enforcement's not our issue. I wasn't sure if what you were saying, if we shouldn't impose something if it can't be enforced. We should just not even go down this road.
As a practical matter, I do not like imposing conditions that do, as you know from one of our other hearings, that are meaningless. If they can't be enforced, it does not behoove us to try to control people in ways that would only create further conflict. I mean,
I would think that the conditions that were suggested by Mr. Mudd could be enforced, related to screening, related to some of the other things, the tree buffers, and he does suggest a limit on parking of the 4 paddocks and the 35 spaces. And if in fact a community member saw them parking other places or parking in other fields or whatever, that could be enforced as a regular thing from our permits and licensing people. They'd take photos of it. They'd come out and say, hey, look, we got photos of you parking here. We're going to, whatever penalties they would impose. So
let me go through Mr. Mudd's conditions just so that we're clear. The first was to amend condition number 4 from the 2017 order that the brewery produced 2,500 barrels rather than 5,000. The second was to install a permanent sound meter on the property boundary line along Marco Road at the closest point between the boundary line and the bank barn to monitor the level so it doesn't exceed the COMAR regulations, and make the sound readings available to the county or neighbors upon request. I don't have a problem with it. I don't think it's a very anyway. Number 3 was Inverness will limit parking for day-to-day operations to the 2 acres depicted on Exhibit A, and will limit parking to the 4-acre area depicted on Exhibit A for promotional events. And that's subject to their ability to file a petition for special hearing if they need to increase or modify that. The 4th was they will install fencing and hardwood trees as shown on Exhibit D to provide screening of the parking area from Marco Road, which probably will also result in, by the way, some buffering of noise. Number 5 was they will install an evergreen tree buffer as shown on Exhibit C to screen headlights from shining toward residents on J.M. Pierce Road. Item 6 was they will install an evergreen buffer as shown on Exhibit D to provide additional screening when viewing the brewery from Marco Road. Number 7, they will reconfigure the fencing around the bank barn to keep the brewery patrons further from Marco Road, as shown on Exhibit D. They will install a brewery sign at the location shown on Exhibit E to direct patrons toward the brewery, and so they won't go onto adjacent properties, subject to sign approval. Number 9, they will reconfigure the access from the parking area shown on Exhibit F to eliminate use of the farm road farm road north of the parking area, and will direct all traffic in and out of the brewery via the entrance located along Marco Road as shown on Exhibit F. And I would add to that the limitations on the use of J.M. Pierce Road and the installation of a gate as was agreed upon and I believe is shown on Exhibit F. I would also suggest that in addition to those limitations, we add no amplified music, that we add that a promotional event will be one that is deemed to last till 10 p.m. It's an event where the brewery remains open until 10 p.m. And that there be no amplified music of any sort at any time. So it would be Mr. Mudd's conditions, the addition of the gate and limitation on J.M. Pierce Road, the addition that a promotional event will be deemed an occasion where the brewery remains open until 10 p.m. We will add that there would be no amplified music, and that the amended site plan must be an engineered amended site plan consistent with our order must be submitted to PAI and the Office of Planning within 45 days of our decision becoming final. Is there anything you think we should add?
Let me go through Mr. McCann's list just so, because I'm the one who was using Mr. Mudd, and I don't want to give the appearance that's guiding the decisions. Just when I reviewed all those things, those seem to be reasonable. We've now added. And so Mr. McCann's proposed number 1 to involve music and no amplification without regard to events, special or daily operations. We've already agreed with that one. So we're adopting his number 1 as to music. Parking, he's proposing that for day-to-day events, only the pre-existing area of 35 spaces, and also for promotional events, we've disagreed with that, and we've addressed parking as proposed by Mr. Mudd. And then number 2, Mr. McCann adds proposals for the following, which you've mentioned, Chair Duncan. Retail sales must be accessory, less than 50% of sales and volume of beer sold. And then the other one deals with defining an event, which he gives 5 factors. So let me blow this up to make sure I can read it right. He's saying an occurrence would constitute an event and count towards 8 event limit if one or more of the following occurs. Live amplified music, we've already said that can't occur. More than 35 spaces are used, we've disregarded that. 3, occurrences advertised or posted on social media, 4 tickets are sold or cover is charged, and 5 any beer release. I think that we've just sort of broadly addressed those, and we're saying if they're gonna want to be open till 10, then that's going to constitute a promotional event.
He also proposed no further structures for brewery use.
Oh yeah, I missed that one. Thank you.
Yeah,
And he said no additional equipment for brewery use. I tend to not want to tie their hands on additional equipment, but if they're going to have further structures, they have to come in for a special hearing.
Do we even need to add that? I mean, we're not making
Well,
a
I
new
would
order.
want it wasn't in the original order. I think it is clear that if they add another shed or barn, which would otherwise be permitted on a farm as a matter of right, and it is for the brewery, either in part or in whole, they need to amend the site plan.
yes, I would agree.
I'm just asking is, I don't have a problem with that, but I'm just asking is, you feel the need to put that into our order. You don't believe that's already the existing requirement?
I believe it is not clear, because if they build another barn and as, for example, we need to add something when we talk about J.M. Pierce Road, that the area that's been cleared for the pole barn cannot be used for anything but a pole barn for farm use, not for brewery use. A
I
barn
would,
is permitted as a matter of right. We're limiting that barn to non-brewery agricultural uses, for
That's
the
specific.
farm.
well,
That's
perhaps,
specifically before. I'm sorry, Mr. Lauer, go ahead.
yeah, I would think that perhaps we would put something in there that said, any further development related to the pole barn, or related to the farm brewery shall require an amended plan. I mean, so if they put up another structure for a horse running shed or whatever it is, that would normally be allowed in this rural conservation area. But as long as it doesn't relate to the brewery, who cares? You know, that would be my thought. That
I'm
maybe
concerned that we're
some kind of
addressing something that's not before us. But again, maybe I'm misunderstanding. The pole barn was a specific subject of the hearing that was before us. We had,
Yes, but
notice was given. What's that?
I believe that one of the issues that came up was that an additional building was being added for, was it a shed of some sort for beer sales that was not on the original plan for brewery use. I don't have a problem adding the condition as Mr. Lauer suggested.
All right, well, my final point, I just want to be heard on. I just want to make sure that we are not imposing a prohibition on something that's not properly before us, that didn't have the due process of being vetted. That there is no other building that's before us, and we're saying, well, if you decide in the future, we're here on a 2017 order, and we were determining whether there were violations of it, and now we're talking about imposing a condition about future structures for whatever purpose, and that intent and that perception by the community might be different. And
Well,
I
I think that's why Mr. Lauer went to any other development for the brewery use would require a special hearing to amend the site plan. And I think that is before us. The site plan is clearly before us.
wouldn't that be required whether we say it or not?
Yes,
Yeah.
but it would have been required and we wouldn't have gotten to this point this way if it had been complied with.
All right,
Even
well,
though it's what should have happened and it didn't.
I'll reserve my judgment on that point until we write this, and maybe I'll concur, maybe I won't. I don't know how I feel on that one.
All right, so let's go back over where we are and see what we agree on. We basically determined under the question of whether there was a violation of the original order, that it was a violation of nonconformity with the site plan, but generally not with the operational provisions and conditions of that order. We agreed that we would add the limitations regarding J.M. Pierce Road, the gate, and the pole barn. We would permit 8 promotional events of up to 3 days, with the distinction that a promotional event is an occasion that the brewery remains open until 10 p.m., being the distinguishing factor. We would add the condition that there be no amplified music, that sales be accessory, that any future development for the brewery use will require a special hearing and amended plan, and that an engineered plan incorporating will incorporate Mr. Mudd's list of conditions, including exhibits, and that they be submitted in an engineered plan within 45 days of entry of a final order. And that's all I have.
I am perfectly okay with that, Madam Chair.
Yeah, I agree with just the one exception. I'm not sure where I am on the future development piece, but it doesn't impact the decision. I'll either concur or I'll dissent. And then just for completeness, and I know we're running way over, but we've addressed what I believe are Mr. DeShiel's proposals, whether we've agreed or disagreed, and his involved J.M. Pierce and the noise. And I think the noise is addressed by no amplified music and the installation of the decibel meter reading device. And then J.M. Pierce Road access was specifically addressed, and you even referred to it with regard to Ms. Owen's appeal. So I think we've gone through those as well. I just, again, wanted to make sure. And then I'm not actually sure what, I think that Office of People's Counsel
Had a much more restrictive view of what an event should be, but
yeah,
I don't think we're going there from what I've heard from both of you.
yeah, they had very specific definitions over the course of several pages proposed.
And yeah, they did. And I think that you were correct that would be difficult to incorporate. Okay, I think that's where we are. And we're in agreement as I recapped it.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to try to summarize what we did and send you both the list, and we can decide how to attack the order after that. We're running late. I'm going to go off the record and terminate this deliberation and take about a 5-minute break before we reconvene for the next hearing.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you both. This
Thank you.
was not an easy case.
Nope. Thank you.
Bye-bye.